What happens when the man who decides your life is too expensive to save discovers he just canceled treatment in a hospital owned by the father you never knew was watching? In Lagos, where glass towers swallow the sun and suffering happens behind private curtains, one woman's fight for survival becomes a reckoning no one saw coming. Adanna Nwosu believed love would sustain her through illness. She believed marriage was a shelter. She believed endurance earned loyalty. But on the day her husband walked into her oncology suite with cancellation papers in one hand and his mistress's ambition in the other, every belief shattered like the four drips still fighting for her when no one else would. This is the story of a woman priced like cement, a man who mistook cruelty for pragmatism, and a father who hid in wealth for 30 years until the day he walked into a boardroom and finally stopped running. Because some betrayals don't just break hearts. They reveal empires. And some fathers don't rescue you from danger. They own the building where your enemies thought they'd bury you. Adanna Nwosu had always been the kind of woman who remembered things other people forgot. Birthdays written in neat handwriting on a kitchen calendar. Her colleague's daughter's wedding date circled in red ink 3 months ahead. The exact way her widowed mother liked her jollof rice seasoned, packaged carefully in takeaway containers and sent to the village every month without fail because love, she believed, was in the details. She was 34, an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Yaba, the kind of employee who stayed late to fix other people's errors and never complained when credit went elsewhere. Soft-spoken, steady, the woman coworkers came to when their marriages were breaking or their children were failing school because Adanna knew how to listen without judgment, how to hold pain without making it heavier. She had married Chinedu at 26, in a small ceremony her mother could barely afford, where he knelt in the red dust outside their compound and swore to God and her ancestors that he would die before letting harm touch her. They built a life in Lagos, modest but warm. A rented duplex in Aja. 2 children, Peace, 8 years old with her father's smile, and David, 6, who clung to Adanna's wrapper every morning before school and made her promise she'd be there when he got home. She had kept every promise. Until the morning she collapsed in the kitchen. One moment she was frying plantain for the children's breakfast. The next she was on the tile floor, Peace's tiny hands pressing against her cheeks, screaming, "Mummy, wake up. Mummy, wake up." In a voice that would haunt her even through the anesthesia months later. She woke in St. Gabriel's Specialist Hospital with a word she didn't fully understand yet. Cancer. Stage 3. Aggressive. Treatable, the doctor said carefully if they acted fast, if they committed, if they didn't give up. Adanna didn't plan to give up. She had children who still needed her to braid their hair and check their homework and tell them everything would be all right even when she wasn't sure herself. She had a mother in the village whose hands had cracked open from years of scrubbing floors to put Adanna through school, who deserved to see her daughter survive. And she had faith, the kind her grandmother taught her, the kind that believed suffering had a purpose, that endurance was a form of prayer, that love would sustain you when your body couldn't. So she endured. The chemotherapy that turned her stomach inside out. The hair loss that made her cry the first time, but not the second. The red hospital gown she wore like armor during the long days when Chinedu couldn't visit because of work, when her sister brought the children but kept the visit short because it's too much for them to see you like this. The 4-line dripping slowly into her arm became her most faithful companion, the machine beside her bed blinking in stubborn rhythm, the only thing that never lied about still fighting for her when everyone else had started to look tired. She told herself that this was the test. That illness revealed who really loved you. That the people who stayed mattered more than the people who ran. She didn't know yet that she'd already failed the test by believing she had to earn the right to survive. Chinedu Nwosu had once been the kind of man who cried in bathrooms where no one could see him. The day the doctor first said stage 3, he locked himself in the tiny toilet off the hospital corridor and pressed his forehead against the cold tile wall, shoulders shaking, making sounds he didn't know a grown man could make. When he came out 20 minutes later, eyes red but face composed, he'd taken Adanna's hand and said, "We will fight this together. I'm not going anywhere." That version of Chinedu felt like a stranger now. It wasn't a single moment that changed him. It was the slow accumulation of numbers that didn't add up, bills that kept coming, a savings account that bled out faster than his wife's veins during chemotherapy. 250,000 naira for the first cycle, 300,000 for the second. The oncologist speaking in careful tones about aggressive treatment protocols and imported medications and the best chance we can give her, all of which translated into money Chinedu didn't have and couldn't find fast enough. He'd sold the plot of land his father left him in Enugu.
Gone.
He'd borrowed from his older brother, promising to pay back with interest he couldn't afford. He'd taken a loan against the SUV he'd only finished paying off 6 months before Adanna collapsed. Every time he signed another promissory note, every time he watched another chunk of his future dissolve into hospital receipts, something inside him hardened just a little more. And then there was Monica. She worked at the same firm where he consulted, handling client relations with the kind of confidence Adanna had never possessed. Younger by 6 years, slim in a way that didn't come from illness, always dressed like she understood that appearance was currency in Lagos. She'd started innocently enough, offering to review his loan documents, suggesting financial restructuring strategies, staying late at the office when everyone else had gone home. She listened when he complained about the medical bills. She didn't flinch when he admitted he was drowning. She didn't cry or make him feel guilty for being exhausted. "You can't save someone who's already sinking if they're going to pull you under too," she'd said one night over drinks he shouldn't have been having. Sometimes the kindest thing is knowing when to let go. It sounded like wisdom at the time. It sounded like permission. By the 3rd month of treatment, Chinedu had stopped crying in bathrooms and started calculating. The duplex in Aja, 4 bedrooms, newly renovated, worth at least 40 million if he sold it. But where would he live? Where would the children go? And wouldn't people ask questions? The SUV was already collateral, trapped in a loan structure that would take 3 more years to clear. But his cousin Derek had been pressuring him for months about investing in a new club in Lekki Phase 1, something upscale, something that could generate real money, the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. "How much more are you going to throw at this?" Derek had asked him bluntly during a visit Chinedu never told Adanna about. "The doctors can't even promise she'll make it. You've done your part. You've tried. But you have children to think about. A future to protect. You can't destroy yourself trying to save someone God might already be calling home."
God.
It was convenient how often gods will aligned perfectly with Chinedu's financial interests. Monica had helped him see it clearly. Laid it out in spreadsheets during late-night strategy sessions that stopped being about business, somewhere around the 2nd bottle of wine. If he stopped treatment now, he'd still be in debt, but manageable debt. He could redirect the money that would have gone to the next 2 cycles, easily another million naira, into the club investment. Generate income. Stabilize. Maybe even help Monica open the boutique she'd been dreaming about in Lekki Phase 1, something small but elegant, the kind of place where she could build something of her own. In every plan he sketched out on hotel notepads and restaurant napkins, Monica's name appeared. Her boutique. Their investment. The life they could build once the weight of hospital bills and a dying wife stopped dragging him backward. In none of those plans did Adanna survive. He told himself it wasn't cruelty. It was realism. It was pragmatism. It was protecting the children from a future where their father was destroyed by medical debt and false hope. He told himself he'd tried. He'd done everything a reasonable man could do, and sometimes love meant knowing when to stop fighting battles you couldn't win. So when he walked into St. Gabriel's Specialist Hospital that bright December morning in his perfectly ironed designer shirt and polished leather shoes, carrying a folder marked treatment cancellation, Chinedu Nwosu felt not like a man abandoning his wife, but like a man making a difficult but necessary business decision. He had no idea he was about to meet the actual owner of the building he was standing in. Monica Okafor had learned early that the world gave things to women who looked like they already owned them. At 28, she'd perfected the art of dressing like money even when her account balance told a different story. Designer knockoffs worn with such confidence that no one questioned their authenticity, gold earrings that caught light at precisely the right angle, Cream-colored dresses stretched tight enough to announce ambition without saying a word. She wasn't from money. Her father drove Danfo buses in Oshodi until a stroke left him half paralyzed and bitter. Her mother sold provisions in a wooden kiosk that flooded every rainy season. Monica had clawed her way out of that life with filing skills, strategic friendships, and an instinct for identifying men whose marriages were cracking just enough to let someone new slip through. Chinedu Nwosu had been easy. She'd watched him for months before making her move. The way exhaustion settled into his shoulders every time his phone rang, the way he flinched when colleagues asked about his wife, the way his eyes glazed over during office parties while everyone else laughed. A man drowning didn't need a sermon. He needed someone to tell him the water wasn't his fault. So she became that person. The one who listened without judgment when he complained about medical bills. The one who helped him restructure his finances over late-night work sessions that stopped being about spreadsheets somewhere around the second glass of wine. The one who never cried, never asked him to choose, never made him feel guilty for being human. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she'd told him once, a phrase she'd stolen from Instagram motivational pages and repurposed for her own needs. "You've done everything you could." Sometimes the kindest thing is accepting that some battles aren't yours to win. It sounded profound at the time. It sounded like wisdom instead of what it actually was. Permission to abandon a dying woman so Monica could step into the life she'd been studying like a blueprint. She knew the duplex in Aja inside out without ever visiting, knew it from Chinedu's descriptions during pillow talk. For bedrooms, newly renovated kitchen, marble countertops, a small garden where the children played. She'd already imagined which room would become her walk-in closet, where she'd put her vanity mirror, how she'd redecorate once the medical equipment and sick room smell were gone. The children would adjust. Children always did, especially when their father was happy again, and there was money for things that mattered. New schools, nice clothes, vacations to Dubai she'd document carefully for Instagram. The boutique had been her idea, planted carefully during one of their strategy sessions. "You know what this city needs? A mid-range luxury boutique. Not too expensive, but elegant. Lekki Phase 1. Professional women who want to look expensive without spending millions. I've been researching vendors, studying the market." She'd let the sentence hang there, watching his face, waiting for him to offer what she knew he would. How much would something like that cost to start? She'd had the number ready. 3 million naira for lease and initial stock. Another 2 million for renovations and branding. 5 million total to build something that could generate real income, something that could be theirs, something that proved they weren't just an affair but a partnership, a future, a team. The same week Chinedu told her he decided to stop Adanna's treatment, Monica had put a deposit on a Honda Accord. Nothing extravagant, just something reliable and elegant that said successful businesswoman instead of side chick. She'd already opened an Instagram account for the boutique that didn't exist yet at Monica's Closet Lagos, carefully curated photos of clothing racks and inspiration quotes about building your empire and knowing your worth. In her mind, Adanna was already gone. Not dead exactly, but removed. Returned to her village where she'd fade quietly among relatives and prayer warriors, leaving space for the real future to begin. Monica had even practiced the right facial expression for when people asked about the first wife, a delicate balance of sympathy and distance, the look that said so tragic without saying but life goes on. So when Chinedu asked her to come with him to the hospital that December morning to help finalize some paperwork, Monica dressed carefully. Cream dress that photographed well but looked professional enough for a hospital setting. Gold earrings that caught light without being flashy. She carried a leather clipboard, empty, purely decorative, because women who meant business always carried clipboards. She walked into that glass-walled oncology suite like she was inspecting property she'd already purchased, her eyes scanning the expensive equipment, the private bathroom, the view of Lagos spreading out below. This was the kind of hospital rich people used, the kind of place that charged money Chinedu didn't have and couldn't sustain. She was doing him a favor by helping him see clearly. She was being practical. When the young nurse protested the treatment cancellation, Monica cut in smoothly, with false concern perfected through hours of practicing in her bathroom mirror. You people think we pluck millions from mango trees? We have responsibilities. Business is down. How can you keep paying this kind of money for someone who is just lying down? The words felt powerful in her mouth. Righteous, even. She didn't notice the nurse's hand trembling as she wrote something in Adanna's chart. Didn't see the way the older woman in the bed looked at her, not with hatred, but with a sad, distant recognition, the way you might look at a younger version of yourself who hadn't learned yet that other people's husbands never leave their wives the way they promise. Monica smiled, just slightly, the smile of a woman who'd already moved into Adanna's side of the wardrobe and was simply waiting for the previous tenant to vacate. She had no idea she was building her future on a foundation that was about to crack open and swallow everything she thought she'd secured. The papers were cream-colored, official, stamped with the hospital's logo in dark blue ink. Treatment discontinuation request printed across the top in letters that seemed too clean, too bureaucratic for what they actually meant. Nurse Chioma held them in both hands like they might catch fire, her eyes moving from the documents to Chinita's face to Adanna's still form on the bed, searching for some intervention that wasn't coming. "Sir," she said carefully, her voice pitched low the way medical professionals speak when they're trying not to alarm the patient, the oncologist recommended continuing the next 2 cycles. "Your wife is responding to treatment. Her white blood cell count has stabilized. The tumors are shrinking. We just need—" "We don't have the money," Monica cut in before Chinita could answer, her voice smooth as cream, laced with a kind of false concern that made it sound like she was being merciful instead of cruel. "You people think we pluck millions from mango trees? Look at us. We have responsibilities. Loans. Business is down. How can you keep paying this kind of money for someone who is just lying down?" The phrase hung in the air like poison. Someone who is just lying down. As if Adanna had chosen this. As if cancer was laziness. As if chemotherapy was optional. As if dying slowly in a hospital bed was somehow less work than the living being done outside these glass walls. Chioma's jaw tightened. "Ma, with respect, she's not just lying down. She's fighting stage 3 cancer. The treatment is working. If we stop now, we can at least salvage something," Chinita interrupted, his tone flat and businesslike, the voice he used when negotiating contracts, not deciding whether his wife lived or died. "The doctor said there's still a chance she may not survive even with treatment. How long do we keep throwing money into a pit?" He turned slightly toward Adanna, using the shortened version of her name like a weapon, like familiarity could soften what he was about to say. "Ada. Let's be realistic. We have sold land. We have borrowed from everyone. My brother won't even take my calls anymore. We're drowning. And for what? The doctor can't promise anything. But we have 2 children whose school fees are coming up. We have responsibilities that will outlive this." He couldn't even say you. Couldn't name what he was choosing to let die. "We can take you home," he continued, his words trembling just enough to sound like frustration instead of guilt, like he was the victim of impossible circumstances rather than the architect of abandonment. "Church is praying. Pastor said the elders are fasting for you. If God wants you to be healed, he doesn't need chemotherapy. He can do it anywhere. In the village, with prayer, with faith. That's what really matters, isn't it?" "Faith." Monica nodded with exaggerated piety, her gold earrings catching the harsh hospital light. "Exactly. We can use that money to at least secure your children's future," she added, as if she'd carried those children in her own womb, as if she'd been the one screaming through 36 hours of labor to bring them into the world. Peace and David need their father to be strong, not destroyed by debt. Sometimes faith means trusting God's will instead of fighting it. The mention of her children's names, spoken so casually by this woman who'd never braided Peace's hair or sung David to sleep, landed like a physical blow. Adanna felt something crack inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with cancer. She remembered the morning she collapsed while frying plantain, remembered Peace's tiny hands pressing against her cheeks, screaming, "Mummy, wake up," in a voice soaked with terror. Remembered David refusing to let go of her hospital gown during their last visit, his small body shaking as he whispered, "Mummy, please don't die. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." Now Chinita stood at the foot of her bed, using those same children as justification to let her die slowly on local herbs in a village bed, stripped of the medicine that was actually working, so he could secure their future with a woman who looked at them like accessories to a life she was already redecorating. Adanna tried to speak. The metallic taste in her mouth, left over from yesterday's chemotherapy, coated her tongue. Exhaustion pressed down on her like a physical weight, making even breathing feel like labor. But worse than the physical weakness was the moment her eyes met Chinita's, and she saw the truth he was trying to hide behind financial spreadsheets and religious language. He'd already buried her. In his mind, in his plans, in the future he was building with Monica's boutique and his cousin's club and the life that required her to be gone. She wasn't a wife fighting for survival. She was a bad investment, a sinking cost, an obstacle between him and the comfort he'd convinced himself he deserved. "Chinitu," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the four machines' rhythmic beeping. "I'm still here." He flinched, just slightly, but didn't meet her eyes. "I know. But for how long? We have to be practical." Nurse Chioma's hand trembled as she held the papers. 26 years old, 3 years out of nursing school, she'd seen patients die from lack of funds before. She'd held hands while families made impossible choices. But this felt different. This woman wasn't dying from lack of medicine. She was dying from lack of love. "I need to submit this to the medical director," Chioma said quietly, her professional mask cracking just enough to reveal fury underneath. "And I need to note in the file that this discontinuation is against medical advice and contrary to the patient's prognosis." "Note whatever you want," Monica said dismissively. "We're not asking for permission. We're informing you of a decision that's already made." Chioma looked at Adanna one more time. Their eyes met. In that brief exchange, something passed between them, woman to woman, a recognition of injustice that couldn't be spoken aloud in front of the people causing it. "I understand," Chioma said carefully. "I'll process the paperwork. But I'll also be filing a report with our ethics board. It's hospital policy for cases where treatment discontinuation might constitute abandonment." The word landed sharp and clean. Abandonment. Not a business decision. Not faith. Not pragmatism. Abandonment. Chinita's face flushed. "Now wait just a minute." "It's procedure, sir," Chioma said, her voice steady now, professional armor back in place. "Nothing personal. Just policy." She left the room with the papers and something else. A flag raised in a system that sometimes responded when love failed. A young nurse who refused to let cruelty hide behind bureaucracy and false prayers. In her station outside the ward, Chioma pulled up the hospital's ethics reporting portal and began typing with shaking hands. She didn't know that her report would travel through administrative channels to a legal team that monitored every hospital in the OB Health Holdings network. Didn't know that one particular name on the patient file would make an old man's heart stop. She only knew that sometimes, when you can't save someone yourself, the best you can do is make sure someone with more power knows they're dying. Imo State, 1994. Red sand roads that stained everything they touched, turning children's feet the color of rust by afternoon. A small girl, maybe 3 years old, ran barefoot past a compound where chickens scratched in the dust and women pounded yam in wooden mortars, her laughter high and pure, chasing after her older siblings with a broken doll clutched against her chest. Under the mango tree at the edge of the compound, a quiet man stood watching. Young, maybe 25, wearing the worn clothes of someone who worked with his hands. He didn't call out to the girl. Didn't wave. Just watched with something like longing and distance mixed together in his eyes, the way you might watch a life you had no right to enter. The girl's name was Adanna. The man's name was Vincent Obi. And he was her father. But that wasn't the story Adanna grew up knowing. The story she learned came in fragments, whispered by aunties when they thought she wasn't listening, spoken in bitter half-sentences by her mother Ngozi during the hardest nights when money ran out and firewood wouldn't sell. Her father was a useless man, a driver who'd gotten her mother pregnant and disappeared into Lagos with promises that turned to dust. "Send money," he'd said. "Come back a big man," he'd sworn. "Make a life for us," he'd promised. The money never came. The big man never returned. And Ngozi never spoke his name again. She scrubbed floors in rich people's houses until her knees went bad. Sold firewood bundled with wire until her hands cracked open and bled. Took in washing and mending and anything that would put food in her children's mouths and keep them in school. She never remarried. Never let another man close enough to make promises. Just worked herself into exhaustion, making sure her firstborn daughter, the one who looked so much like the man who'd abandoned them, would finish university and have a better life than red sand roads and broken promises. By the time Adanna graduated, she believed her father had died long ago, another careless man swallowed by Lagos's indifference, leaving nothing behind but silence and a maiden name she rarely used. She never knew that man hadn't died, that he'd survived on shame and turned it into something harder than steel. Vincent Obi left the village with one bag, 50 naira, and a promise he meant to keep even if it took decades. He started as a driver. Other people's cars, other people's routes, other people's dreams. He saved every kobo, slept in the taxi park, ate once a day. When he had enough, he bought a beaten Danfo bus. Then another. Then a small fleet. He didn't drink, didn't chase women, didn't waste money on the things that made Lagos men visible. He just worked with the focused intensity of someone trying to outrun his own cowardice. The buses became a transport company. The transport money became investment in a struggling clinic in Trillionaire. The clinic became 3 clinics, then a small hospital, then partnerships with pharmaceutical suppliers who needed distribution networks. By 2010, Vincent Obi controlled one of West Africa's largest private medical networks through layers of shell companies and holding firms that kept his name invisible. He donated to hospitals under different corporate entities, funded research through anonymous trusts, bought struggling clinics and turned them into something sustainable, always hiding his face from newspapers, always avoiding cameras. His lawyers knew the instruction by heart. "My children must never know it's me until I am sure they cannot be destroyed by my name." He'd watched enough people change when they discovered wealth. Watched relatives become parasites. Watched love turn transactional. Watched children of rich men become targets. Kidnapped, manipulated, loved for money instead of character. He'd built his empire in the shadows because he wanted his children to be loved for themselves before anyone discovered what they were inheriting. Somewhere in those years, shame had become philosophy. Distance had become protection. Absence had become a gift he told himself they needed. He paid for Adanna's secondary school fees through an anonymous scholarship program, made sure her university tuition appeared as a government grant, pulled strings unseen when she struggled to find her first accounting job. He watched from afar, through lawyers and quarterly reports, telling himself she was better off without a father who'd once abandoned her mother pregnant and penniless. Then one December morning, his legal team sent their routine ethics report, flagged cases from hospitals in the Obi Health Holdings network requiring executive review. Most were standard: billing disputes, treatment disagreements, insurance complications. One made his assistant pause before forwarding it. St. Gabriel Specialist Hospital, Lekki. Ethics violation filed by nursing staff. Husband discontinuing wife's cancer treatment against medical advice to save money. Patient prognosis positive, but treatment cancelled due to claimed financial constraints. Nursing staff concerned about potential abandonment. Patient details attached. Vincent opened the file with a detached interest of a businessman reviewing corporate problems. Then he saw the name. Patient: Adanna Nwosu, née Obi. Age: 34. Diagnosis: Stage 3 cancer. Status: treatment discontinued by spouse. Next of kin: Chinita Nwosu, husband. The document slipped from his hands. His heart, 71 years old, weakened by stress and statins, pounded against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Obi. Her maiden name. Her mother's name. The name he'd given her before he ran away and never came back. His daughter. Fighting cancer in a hospital he indirectly owned. Married to a man who thought canceling her treatment would free him from debt. Vincent's hands trembled as he pulled up the full medical file. There was a photo attached, standard patient documentation. A woman with her mother's delicate features and his own stubborn jawline, head wrapped in a scarf, eyes tired but defiant in a red hospital gown. The small girl who used to run barefoot on red sand roads, chasing her siblings with a broken doll. Now dying in his hospital because her husband had decided her life cost too much. Vincent stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble floors. His assistant looked up, alarmed. In 30 years, she'd never seen him move with such urgency. "Sir? Cancel everything," he said, his voice rough. "Contact the St. Gabriel board. Emergency meeting. I'm going in person." "Sir, you never go in person. That's why we have representatives." "This is different." His jaw tightened. "This is my daughter." The assistant's eyes widened. In 15 years of working for Chief Vincent Obi, she'd never heard him speak those words. Vincent grabbed his agbada from the hook behind his door. For 30 years, he'd hidden behind holding companies and legal structures, telling himself his children were better off not knowing. That love required distance. That protection meant absence. But this wasn't about his shame anymore. This was about his daughter's life. And for the first time since he left that village with 50 naira and broken promises, Vincent Obi was going to stop running and face what he'd spent decades avoiding. The cost of being a coward. And the price of finally standing still. 2 days after Chinita signed the cancellation forms, Adanna lay staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the small imperfections in the white surface because it was easier than thinking about what came next. The 4 had been removed that morning. The machine that used to beat beside her bed, her only faithful companion, sat silent and unplugged in the corner like evidence of a battle someone else had decided wasn't worth finishing. She felt death creeping closer, not from the cancer, but from something worse. Betrayal had a particular weight to it, heavier than tumors, more exhausting than chemotherapy. It pressed down on her chest and made breathing feel optional, made her wonder if maybe Chinita was right, if maybe the kindest thing was to stop fighting and let everyone move on with the lives they'd already planned without her. Nurse Chioma had slipped in earlier with whispered apologies, saying she'd filed a report, that she'd done everything she could without losing her job. Adanna had squeezed the young woman's hand and whispered, "Thank you, my daughter," even as she wondered what good reports did when love had already made its calculations, and walked away. Around noon, the ward doors slid open with a smooth hydraulic whisper of expensive hospital infrastructure. Adanna barely looked up at first. Visitors came and went. Nurses checking vitals out of habit even though treatment had stopped. Orderlies collecting meal trays she hadn't touched. Occasionally her sister bringing whispered updates about the children that made Adanna's chest ache. But this was different. A cluster of people walked in with the kind of purposeful energy that changes the temperature of a room. Men and women in expensive suits, ID tags swinging from lanyards, faces set in expressions of professional seriousness. Not doctors making rounds. Not administrators handling paperwork. This was power moving with intention. At the center of the group walked an older man in a finely tailored gray agbada, the kind of garment that announced both wealth and cultural gravitas without needing to say a word. His beard was neatly groomed, white at the edges, his posture straight despite what had to be at least 70 years weighing on his frame. His eyes were sharp, alert, the kind of eyes that had spent decades reading contracts and people with equal precision. But there was something else, too. A quietness. A humility in the way he moved that seemed almost out of place for someone who commanded this much instinctive respect. People stepped aside for him without being asked, but he himself walked with the careful grace of someone who knew power was a responsibility, not a weapon. Behind him came faces Adanna vaguely recognized from hallway encounters. The medical director in his white coat, Dr. Alisa, the head of oncology, who'd first explained her diagnosis with devastating gentleness, a woman in a dark suit carrying a leather portfolio who had legal officer, written in everything from her posture to her expression, and a man with wire-rimmed glasses representing what the embroidered logo on his jacket identified as OB Health Holdings, Corporate Affairs. Chinidu had arrived that morning with Monica, ostensibly to check on her before discharge, though Adanna suspected they were really there to ensure the paperwork stayed processed, that she didn't somehow reverse the decision he'd made. He stood near the window now, scrolling through his phone, while Monica sat in the visitor's chair flipping through a magazine about interior design, occasionally showing him pictures of furniture as if they were already planning which pieces to keep and which to replace. The moment the doors opened and the group entered, Chinidu straightened reflexively. His businessman instincts activated like muscle memory. Phone vanished into his pocket, shoulders squared, expression shifting into that charming smile he used when trying to secure contracts or impress people who might be useful. He smoothed his designer shirt, adjusted his collar, and stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who assumed he belonged in every room he entered. Monica noticed the older man's agbada first, her eyes tracking the quality of the fabric, the gold embroidery at the edges. Expensive. Important. She stood quickly, adjusted her posture, crossed her legs at the ankle in that practice way women do when they want to look simultaneously professional and appealing. Both of them assumed this was routine. A hospital board making rounds. Perhaps a quality assurance visit. Maybe even an opportunity. Chinidu was already calculating how to position himself, whether he could mention his difficult decision, in a way that made him sound responsible rather than cruel. Neither of them saw what Adanna saw from her bed. The older man's hand trembling, just slightly, as his gaze swept the room and landed on her face. The way his breath caught, barely perceptible, but there. The flash of something raw crossing his features, shock, then pain, then something that looked devastatingly like recognition mixed with grief. He stared at her the way you might stare at a photograph come to life, or a memory you'd buried so deep you'd convinced yourself it was safely forgotten. His eyes traced her face, the shape of her cheekbones, the set of her jaw, the way exhaustion and illness had carved her features into something both fragile and defiant. For a moment that stretched too long, the entire room seemed to freeze. Adanna blinked, confused, her weakened mind struggling to understand why this stranger was looking at her like his heart was breaking. There was something disturbingly familiar about him. The curve of his jaw. The way he tilted his head slightly when he looked at her. The depth in his eyes that carried decades of something she couldn't name. Like a face from a faded photograph her mother had burned years ago. Like a voice from a memory too old to trust. The medical director cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Mrs. Nwosu, he began formally, his tone carrying the weight of institutional authority. My name is Dr. Alisa. This is the chairman of our board. He gestured toward the man in gray agbada, who still hadn't looked away from Adanna's face. We're here, Dr. Alisa continued carefully, to discuss some concerns that have been raised regarding your treatment plan. Chinidu's smile widened, confident now. Whatever this was, he assumed it would confirm his decision, validate his pragmatism. He had no idea he was standing in a building owned by a man who just recognized his daughter and was about to dismantle every calculation Chinidu thought he'd made. The older man stepped forward, his gray agbada rustling softly in the air-conditioned silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the texture of someone who'd spent decades issuing quiet commands that entire organizations obeyed. My name is Chief Vincent Obi, he said, his eyes still fixed on Adanna's face. We oversee the group that owns this hospital. The room went absolutely still. Chinidu's smile froze mid-expression, confusion flickering across his features like static. Monica's glossy lips parted slightly, her magazine sliding forgotten onto her lap. Owns? The word hung there, reshaping everything they thought they understood about this meeting. Vincent moved closer to the bed, his polished shoes silent against hospital tile, ignoring Chinidu's presence completely as if the man were furniture, decoration, something beneath notice. His focus remained locked on Adanna with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "We received a report," he continued, his voice roughening with something that sounded like barely controlled emotion. "A report that your treatment was cancelled against medical advice, citing financial constraints, while your prognosis was still hopeful." His eyes softened as they traveled across her weakened frame. The way the red hospital gown hung loose on shoulders that had lost too much weight, the patterned scarf wrapped carefully around her head hiding what chemotherapy had stolen, the angry bruise on her inner arm where the foreline had been removed 2 days too early. "Is that what you want, my daughter?" The last 2 words slipped out quiet, almost tender, but they detonated in the room like a grenade. "My daughter." The phrase hung suspended between them, electric and devastating, impossible and undeniable. Adanna's breath caught in her throat. Her exhausted mind scrambled, replaying what he'd just said, the way he'd said it. Obi. He'd said his name was Obi. Her maiden name. Her mother's name before shame and abandonment reduced it to something never spoken aloud. She stared at him, really looked at him now. And the pieces that had been floating just outside her consciousness suddenly crashed together with brutal clarity. The shape of his eyes that she saw every time she looked in a mirror. The curve of his jaw that her daughter piece had inherited. The way he tilted his head slightly when he looked at her. The same unconscious gesture her mother used to flinch away from an old wedding photos before she burned them all. A face from a faded photograph. A name scrubbed from family history. The man under the mango tree watching her play, that memory so old she'd convinced herself she'd imagined it. Her voice came out broken, barely a whisper. "I don't want to die." Tears filled her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them, because saying it out loud to this stranger, who somehow wasn't a stranger, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Not "I want to fight." Not "I want to try." Just the raw, animal truth. "I don't want to die." Chinita sensed control slipping through his fingers like water. He stepped forward quickly, his businessman instinct screaming at him to regain authority over a situation that no longer made sense. "Sir, with all due respect," he said, gesturing smoothly between himself and Adanna with practiced ease, "this is a family decision. We cannot kill ourselves because of hospital bills. We have done our best. God will do the rest." He tried to chuckle, but it came out thin, desperate. "Sometimes you have to be practical about these things." Vincent turned to look at him properly for the first time. The softness vanished from his face, replaced by something cold and precise as surgical steel. "And who told you?" he asked quietly, each word measured and deliberate, "that the bill was yours to pay?" Chinita's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. Vincent nodded slightly to the legal officer, who stepped forward and opened her leather portfolio with the crisp efficiency of someone about to dismantle a life using only facts and documentation. "Mr. Nwosu," she said formally, her voice carrying no emotion, just information delivered like a scalpel. "St. Gabriel's Specialist Hospital is wholly owned by Obi Health Holdings, which is in turn controlled by the Obi Family Trust." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "As of last month, a resolution was passed to expand the board and a new primary beneficiary was added to the trust." She looked up from her documents, her eyes meeting Chinita's directly. "Her name is Mrs. Adanna Obinwosu, your wife." The words hit Chinita like a physical blow. His face went slack. "Beneficiary of what?" he stammered. "Of the Obi estate," the legal officer replied with the calm of someone reciting grocery lists instead of announcing fortunes. "The controlling interest in this hospital, 3 others in Lagos, pharmaceutical shares, international holdings, and various investments across West Africa and Europe." She paused for effect. "Current valuation is complicated, but safe to say it is more than you or I will ever be able to pronounce comfortably." Monica made a small sound in her throat, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Her gold earrings suddenly felt cheap, costume jewelry. Her boutique dreams disintegrated like smoke. Vincent's gaze cut back to Adanna. When he spoke again, his voice gentled, softening into something almost fragile. Your treatment will not be cancelled, he said firmly.
Not now.
Not ever, unless you decide for yourself that you're tired of fighting. This hospital is yours as much as it is mine. You won't pay another kobo. Adanna's lips trembled. The words made no sense strung together like that. Yours as much as mine? She repeated, her voice barely audible over the blood rushing in her ears. Vincent swallowed hard. The truth pressed against his teeth like a dam about to break. He switched into their village dialect for the first time in 30 years, the Igbo words feeling foreign and familiar all at once on his tongue. Your mother's name, he asked gently, his eyes searching hers. Is it not Ngozi? The sound of her mother's name, spoken in that deep, achingly familiar dialect, pronounced exactly the way her grandmother used to say it, tore something open inside Adanna that she hadn't known was still holding her together. Her mind flashed back violently. Childhood whispers from aunties, fragments about that man who ran to Lagos, her mother's cracked hands from scrubbing floors, the name that was never spoken, the father who was supposed to be dead or might as well be. All the pieces crashed together at once with devastating clarity. Her heart pounded so hard, she thought it might break through her ribs. You, she breathed, staring at him, her eyes wide with a terrible mixture of horror and hope and decades of absence suddenly given flesh. You left us. The accusation slipped out raw, unfiltered, before courtesy or shock could dress it in softer language. Vincent's shoulders sagged. The powerful man in the expensive agbada seemed to shrink, revealing the frightened young driver underneath, the coward who'd run away and never come back. I did, he said quietly, right there in front of her husband, the board, the nurses gathering at the door, the woman in the cream dress still calculating angles in the corner. I was a coward.
Poor.
Ashamed. I thought I'd come back a big man, and you would be proud of me. By the time I could, you were grown, and I did not know how to stand before you and say I was sorry. His voice shook now, the polished businessman slipping away completely. So, I watched from far, paid what I could, sent what I could through people. But I never stepped in. That is my sin, and I will answer for it. He paused, his jaw tightening as he turned slowly toward Chinedu. But I will not watch another man throw away your life, because he cannot count beyond Naira. Vincent turned slowly toward Chinedu, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent 30 years building power and was finally using it for something that mattered. You wanted to save money? He asked with devastating calm. Congratulations. From today, you will save all the money in this marriage for yourself. Because this marriage is over. Chinedu's mouth fell open. You don't have the right. Under normal circumstances, no. Vincent agreed, his tone measured and precise. But your wife does. And she will have everything she needs to stand up without leaning on a man who priced her life like cement. He glanced at the legal officer, who produced another document from her portfolio with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Unknown to you, Mr. Nwosu, the legal officer said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Your wife signed her treatment authorization forms again this morning in the presence of our ethics board, confirming she wants to continue fighting. She also signed another document transferring decision-making power over her medical care and finances into a trust until she is fully recovered and can think without pressure. She paused, letting that land before delivering the killing blow. You are not listed as a trustee. Chinedu stared at the papers, his brain scrambling, trying to find an angle, a loophole, some way to regain control of a situation that had completely inverted. But I'm her husband. I have legal rights. You had legal rights, the legal officer corrected coldly. You forfeited them the moment you prioritized your financial comfort over her medical necessity. She opened another folder. We have CCTV footage from this hospital showing you, and MS. Okafor discussing treatment costs in terms of wasted investment. We have recorded conversations, yes, Mr. Nwosu. This hospital records all patient consultations for quality assurance, where you explicitly stated you wanted to cut losses and redirect funds. She pulled out a third document, this one stamped with bank logos. Most damningly, we have bank statements showing that on the same day you signed the treatment cancellation forms, the very same day you transferred 1.8 million naira from your personal account. 500,000 went to a car dealership as a deposit on a Honda Accord registered to Ms. Monica Okafor. 1 million went to a commercial property agent in Lekki Phase 1 as a lease deposit for a retail space, also in Ms. Okafor's name. She looked up, her expression carved from ice. You weren't saving money, Mr. Nwosu.
You were reallocating it.
From your wife's cancer treatment to your mistress's boutique and car. If you think walking away quietly is an option, I suggest you take it now, before our investigation becomes public and the press gets interested in exactly how you chose to spend money you claimed you didn't have. Monica's face drained of color so fast she looked ill. She let go of Chinita's arm like it had caught fire, stumbling backward toward the door. Her gold earrings felt like handcuffs now, her cream dress like evidence. All the calculations she'd made. The duplex, the children, the Instagram-ready future, disintegrated in real time.
I didn't.
She stammered, but no one was looking at her anymore. She edged closer to the exit, suddenly very interested in becoming invisible, in being anywhere but in this room where her carefully constructed future had just exploded. Chinita stared at the documents, at the board members, at his wife lying pale and quiet in the bed, at the man in the gray bata who owned the building he was standing in. For the first time since Adanna fell sick, genuine fear crossed his face, raw, undisguised, the kind of emotion he hadn't shown through months of her suffering. Ada, he said, his voice cracking, reaching for her with desperation that had never appeared when she was actually dying. Tell them I tried. Tell them I. Adanna looked at him, really looked at him, and the woman who had begged, cried, apologized for being sick, the woman who'd believed endurance earned love. That woman was gone. In her place was someone quieter, but infinitely stronger, the kind of woman who realizes the thing she feared losing had already left long ago. She took a shaky breath, her voice soft but lined with steel. You told them the truth, she said, her eyes never leaving his. You tried. You tried to save money. You tried to save your ego. You tried to save your lifestyle. You tried to build a future with a woman who looked at my children like accessories. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice stayed steady, each word deliberate and final. You just never tried to save me. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Chinita opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he say? She hadn't lied. She hadn't exaggerated. She'd simply named the truth he'd been dressing in financial pragmatism and false prayers for months. Adanna turned her head slightly toward Vincent, this stranger who was somehow her father, this man who'd abandoned her as a child but had just walked into a hospital room and demolished the man who'd tried to abandon her as an adult. My father may have abandoned me once, she said quietly, the words costing her something but needing to be spoken anyway. But I will not abandon myself. Vincent closed his eyes for a moment, the word father landing like both poison and medicine, an indictment and an invitation all at once. When he opened them again, they were filled with something fierce and unwavering, the kind of determination that builds empires or tears them down depending on what justice requires. From today, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion but steady with purpose, you will never have to choose between your life and your bills again. We will finish this treatment. We will bring the best doctors from anywhere in this world, London, Houston, Johannesburg, wherever they are, they will come here. He paused, making sure she heard not just the words, but the vow beneath them. Not because you are rich now. Not because you're my daughter, though God knows I should have claimed you decades ago. But because you were always worthy, before any of this money, before any of these buildings, before any title or inheritance. I was too blind to see it when you were small, too much a coward to face what I'd done. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but every person in that room heard it clearly. I will not make that mistake twice. Chinita stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed justifications collapse under the weight of evidence and truth. Monica had already slipped out the door, her boutique dreams and Instagram plans disappearing with her. And in the bed, surrounded by nurses and lawyers and one broken father finally learning what it means to stand and stay, Adanna Nwosu chose, for the first time in her marriage, perhaps for the first time in her life, to save herself. 6 weeks later, the story hit social media the way lightning hits dry grass, fast, unstoppable, and consuming everything in its path. Someone in the hospital, no one ever confirmed who, though speculation centered on a nurse who'd witnessed the confrontation, shared the story anonymously in a women's empowerment Facebook group. By morning, it had jumped to Twitter. By afternoon, it was trending across 3 countries. By evening, it lived in WhatsApp groups from Lagos to London to Toronto, forwarded with commentary that ranged from righteous fury to quiet validation. God is not sleeping, women typed with varying levels of capitalization and exclamation marks. The phrase appeared thousands of times, a digital amen passing between strangers who'd never met but recognized something in Adanna's story that resonated in their own bones. Church WhatsApp groups erupted in theological debate. Some argued she should forgive Chinita. Marriage is covenant, not convenience. Others countered that covenant required 2 people honoring it, not one woman dying quietly to preserve a man's comfort. Younger women declared they would have left at the first sign of betrayal. Older women admitted, in private messages they didn't share publicly, that they understood why Adanna had stayed as long as she did, because they'd made similar calculations in their own marriages and were only now, seeing her story, beginning to question them. Arguments raged about whether Vincent had earned redemption, whether 30 years of absence could be balanced by one moment of intervention, whether money changed the ethics of abandonment or simply revealed who'd had the privilege to abandon in the first place. But underneath all the debate, beneath the theological arguments and the hot takes and the Instagram infographics about knowing your worth, there was something else. Something quieter. Something women whispered to each other in private conversations and carried in their hearts even when they argued the opposite in public forums. There was justice, profound, poetic, undeniable justice, in a woman everyone had counted out discovering she'd been the hidden heir all along. Justice in a man who'd priced his wife's life in Naira and Kobo discovering he'd been negotiating with his own powerlessness. Justice in a mistress who'd smiled too early learning that other people's marriages weren't vacant properties waiting for new tenants. Justice in a father who'd run for 30 years finally planting his feet and refusing to move. Inside St. Gabriel's Specialist Hospital, Adanna's treatment resumed with a precision and intensity that made her previous care look like preliminary sketches. Vincent brought in an oncologist from MD Anderson in Houston who'd pioneered immunotherapy protocols, a radiologist from London who specialized in targeted treatment, minimizing collateral damage, a nutritionist from Johannesburg who understood both Western medicine and traditional African healing practices, who helped Adanna rebuild her strength with food that honored where she came from while supporting where she needed to go. Her room became something between a medical suite and a command center. Nurses rotated shifts, ensuring someone was always monitoring her progress. The legal team worked in an adjacent office, handling everything from her medical trust to the divorce proceedings Adanna had finally, quietly filed. And Vincent came every day, morning and evening, sometimes just sitting in the chair beside her bed reading newspapers while she slept, learning the simple physics of presence after decades of absence. He didn't try to be forgiven, didn't ask for absolution or offer explanations that sounded like excuses. He just stayed. Learned her medication schedule, remembered which foods made her nauseous, brought pictures of her children that her sister had shared, spreading them across the windowsill where Adanna could see peace and David smiling even when she was too weak to hold the photos herself. "They ask about you every day," he told her one afternoon when she was strong enough for longer conversations. "Your sister says Peace has been praying at night that God will fix Mummy properly this time." Adanna's eyes filled with tears. "I want to see them." "You will," Vincent promised. "When you're stronger. when you can hold them without worrying you'll break. Some days were harder than others. Days when the treatment made her so sick she couldn't remember why she'd chosen to keep fighting. Days when grief over her marriage felt heavier than the cancer. Days when she looked at Vincent and felt the jagged edges of 30 years of absence cutting through whatever fragile connection they were trying to build. But she kept choosing, kept fighting. Not as a wife begging her husband to see her value. Not as a daughter earning her father's belated attention. But as a woman who'd finally understood that her life had never required anyone else's permission to matter. Outside, beyond the glass walls of the private wing, Chinidu came sometimes. Security wouldn't let him pass the lobby, but occasionally staff would see him standing near the entrance, looking up at the building he'd once walked through with such confidence, toward windows he could no longer access. Watching the woman he'd underestimated rise with an army of doctors, nurses, lawyers, and one determined father he'd never imagined existed. Monica never returned. Disappeared into Lagos's endless sprawl, presumably to find another man with another wife whose illness might create another opening. The duplex in Ajay was sold, not by Chinidu, but by Adanna's legal team, the proceeds placed in trust for peace and David's education. The SUV was repossessed when Chinidu could make payments without access to funds he'd assumed would be redirected from cancer treatment.